If you have blue eyes, here is something that sounds almost impossible to believe, but is backed by some of the clearest genetic evidence scientists have ever gathered. Every single blue-eyed person on this planet, whether they are sitting in Sweden, Argentina, Pakistan, or anywhere else, shares the exact same ancestor. Not a similar mutation that happened to occur more than once in different places. The same one. A single person living somewhere near the Black Sea region thousands of years before anyone had ever written a word down carried a tiny genetic change that had never existed in the human species before. And every blue-eyed person alive today is, in a very real and traceable sense, descended from that one individual. Before we get into how researchers actually figured this out, you need to understand just how strange this claim really is once you stop and think about it. Most physical traits that show up across different human populations, things like height, skin tone, or hair texture, tend to have complicated genetic origins, shaped by many different genes interacting with each other, sometimes evolving independently in different populations, facing similar environmental pressures. Eye color for most of human history was assumed to work the same way, a trait controlled by a mix of genes that could plausibly have shifted toward lighter colors in multiple different populations at different times, entirely independently of one another. What researchers eventually discovered about blue eyes broke that assumption completely. To appreciate how surprising this was, it helps to think about how genetics normally handles claims of shared human origin. Every trait, every gene, every tiny variation in human DNA has some kind of history, some point in the deep past where it first appeared. But most traits we can observe today, especially ones connected to something as visible as physical appearance, tend to have messy, tangled origin stories, shaped by thousands of years of small changes accumulating gradually across many different populations, rather than tracing back to one clean, identifiable starting point. Scientists are used to finding complicated, layered answers when they dig into the genetic history of human traits. Blue eyes turned out to be one of the rare exceptions, a trait simple and specific enough at the genetic level that researchers could actually trace it back to a single, precise moment in human history, something that almost never happens with a trait this widespread and this visually distinctive. There are 3 questions this investigation set out to answer, and I want you to hold on to all 3 because the way this story unfolds connects directly to some of the biggest population movements in human history. First, did blue eyes really originate from a single genetic mutation? Or is that just a simplified way of describing something that actually happened more than once? Second, if there really was one single origin point, where and when did it happen? And how did it spread from one person to becoming a trait carried by hundreds of millions of people today? And third, and this is the part that connects blue eyes to a much bigger story than most people expect. What does the spread of this one mutation actually tell us about how humans were moving, mixing, and migrating across entire continents thousands of years ago? Answering these questions required researchers to combine 2 very different scientific disciplines in a way that had rarely been attempted with this level of precision before. On one side, population geneticists needed the raw technical ability to compare full genome sequences from individuals scattered across dozens of different countries, identifying not just broad genetic similarities, but the exact single letter changes within specific genes responsible for producing physical traits. On the other side, they needed a working knowledge of human migration history detailed enough to actually interpret what a shared genetic origin point would mean in terms of real ancient population movements. Neither discipline alone could have produced the full picture. It was only by combining precise genetic dating techniques with a detailed understanding of prehistoric European population movements that researchers were able to turn a simple observation, that blue-eyed people around the world share an identical mutation, into a complete and coherent historical story explaining how and why that mutation ended up spreading as far and as successfully as it did. To understand how researchers even began to investigate this, you have to go back to the basic biology of eye color. Brown eyes are, genetically speaking, the ancestral human condition, produced by relatively high levels of a pigment called melanin concentrated in the iris. Every human population on Earth, going back tens of thousands of years, into every branch of our species, and even into some of our closest extinct relatives, shows overwhelmingly brown-eyed ancestry. Blue eyes, along with the whole spectrum of lighter eye colors that fall somewhere between fully brown and fully blue, represent a departure from that ancestral condition, a reduction in the amount of melanin present in the iris, allowing light to scatter in a way that produces the appearance of blue rather than the deep brown that dominates human eye color history. It is worth understanding that blue is not, technically speaking, a pigment color at all, unlike brown, which comes directly from melanin molecules absorbing and reflecting light in a way that produces a genuinely brown appearance. Blue eyes work through an entirely different physical mechanism, similar in principle to why the sky appears blue despite the atmosphere containing no blue pigment whatsoever. When melanin levels in the iris drop low enough, The remaining structure of the iris scatters shorter wavelengths of light, the blue end of the visible spectrum, more effectively than longer wavelengths, producing the visual appearance of blue even though no actual blue pigment is present anywhere in the eye. This means blue eyes are, in a very real sense, an optical illusion produced by an absence of pigment rather than the presence of any pigment of their own, which makes the fact that this specific absence traces back to one single shared genetic cause even more remarkable once you understand the underlying mechanism. For a long time, geneticists assumed that if blue eyes involved reduced melanin production, there could be many different genetic pathways leading to that same basic outcome. Different mutations in different genes occurring in different populations could all plausibly reduce melanin production enough to produce a lighter eye color, the same way many different paths can lead to similar outward results in biology. This assumption turned out to be almost entirely wrong, and the way researchers proved it wrong is one of the more elegant pieces of detective work in modern human genetics. This assumption was not unreasonable at the time. Biology is generally full of examples of what scientists call convergent evolution, cases where different populations, or even entirely different species, independently arrive at similar physical outcomes because similar environmental pressures push them in similar directions. Pale skin, for instance, appears to have evolved independently through different genetic pathways in European and East Asian populations, as both groups separately adapted to reduced sunlight at higher latitudes. Given that precedent, there was no obvious reason to assume eye color would behave any differently, and plenty of reason to expect that lighter eyes, like lighter skin, had probably emerged more than once through more than one genetic route, in different populations facing broadly similar circumstances. The breakthrough came when a team of researchers systematically compared the DNA of blue-eyed individuals from a wide range of different countries and continents, expecting, if the multiple origin theory were correct, to find a variety of different genetic changes responsible for the trait, depending on which population they were looking at. Instead, they found something that stunned even the researchers running the study. Nearly every blue-eyed person tested, regardless of which country or continent they came from, carried the exact same tiny genetic variation, a single change located near a gene called OCA2, which plays a central role in regulating melanin production throughout the body. This was not simply a case of the same gene being involved across different populations, which would still have been an interesting but less remarkable finding. It was the exact same specific mutation at the exact same specific location, shared by blue-eyed individuals from populations that, as far as anyone could tell, had not had meaningful genetic contact with each other for thousands of years. A blue-eyed person in Denmark and a blue-eyed person in a completely different part of the world, populations separated by enormous distances and by centuries or millennia of largely independent history, were carrying an identical genetic signature. In genetics, when you find the exact same specific mutation at the exact same specific spot in the genome, spread across populations that otherwise show very little genetic overlap, there's really only one plausible explanation. That mutation did not happen more than once. It happened a single time in a single individual, and then spread outward from that one original source through that person's descendants. To rule out any remaining possibility that this could somehow be a coincidence, researchers ran the comparison against an enormous number of additional genetic markers surrounding the mutation itself, checking whether the broader genetic neighborhood around this specific spot in the genome also matched consistently across different populations. If the mutation had genuinely occurred independently in different places, the surrounding genetic material, the small variations that naturally accumulate around any specific point in the genome over generations, should have looked meaningfully different from population to population, since each independent occurrence would have arisen against a different genetic backdrop. Instead, the surrounding genetic signature matched closely across populations as well, providing exactly the kind of corroborating evidence needed to rule out coincidence and confirm, with a very high degree of statistical confidence, that this specific mutation really did trace back to one single common source, rather than multiple independent origins scattered across different parts of the world. Once researchers accepted this conclusion, the next obvious question became when and where this original mutation actually occurred. Answering this required a completely different set of tools than simply identifying the mutation itself. Geneticists use a technique that essentially works backward from the genetic diversity surrounding a specific mutation, measuring how much small-scale genetic variation has accumulated in the DNA immediately next to that mutation across different populations carrying it. Mutations that happened a very long time ago tend to accumulate more of this surrounding variation over successive generations, while more recent mutations show comparatively little. By carefully measuring this pattern across a large number of blue-eyed individuals, researchers were able to estimate, with a surprising degree of precision, roughly how long ago the original mutation must have occurred. This technique, often referred to by geneticists as a molecular clock, relies on the fact that mutations across the genome accumulate at a roughly predictable rate over time, functioning almost like a genetic timestamp buried inside every strand of DNA. It is somewhat similar in principle to how geologists use radioactive decay to date rock formations, except instead of measuring the decay of unstable atoms, geneticists are measuring the slow, steady accumulation of small genetic changes that naturally occur every time DNA gets copied and passed down from one generation to the next. Because this rate of accumulation has been calibrated extensively against events with independently known dates, researchers can use it to estimate the age of a specific mutation with a level of confidence that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago, turning a strand of DNA into something remarkably close to a historical record with its own built-in timeline. The estimate that came out of this analysis placed the origin of the blue-eyed mutation somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, a period that lines up strikingly well with the major transitional eras in human history, the spread of early farming populations out of the Fertile Crescent region and into Europe. Combined with additional genetic evidence tracing the geographic distribution of the earliest carriers of this mutation, researchers narrowed the likely origin point to somewhere in the region surrounding the Black Sea, an area that sat directly along the migration routes early farming populations used as agriculture gradually spread outward from its origins in the Middle East into the rest of Europe. The Black Sea region occupies a genuinely pivotal position in the story of early human migration, sitting at the crossroads between the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture first emerged, and the vast open plains of Eastern Europe and the Eurasian steppe, corridors that later population movements would use repeatedly throughout prehistory to spread people, languages, technologies, and genes across an enormous span of territory. A mutation originating in or near this region would have found itself perfectly positioned at exactly the right geographic bottleneck to be carried outward in multiple directions at once, riding along with any of several major population movements that historians and geneticists now know swept through this corridor during the Neolithic period and the millennia that followed it. This timing is not a coincidence, and understanding why connects blue eyes directly to one of the most significant population movements in all of human prehistory. The spread of agriculture across Europe, beginning roughly 10,000 years ago and continuing over the following several millennia, was not simply a matter of existing hunter-gatherer populations independently deciding to adopt farming techniques. Genetic evidence gathered from ancient skeletal remains across the continent has shown, repeatedly and consistently, that farming spread primarily through the actual migration of farming populations themselves, moving outward from the Near East and gradually mixing with, and in many regions substantially replacing, the hunter-gatherer populations who had lived in Europe for tens of thousands of years before agriculture ever arrived. This finding, that farming spread mainly through migrating people rather than spreading ideas, was itself one of the major discoveries to come out of ancient DNA research over the past 2 decades. And it fundamentally reshaped how historians think about the Neolithic transition across the entire continent. For a long time, the dominant assumption in archaeology held that farming techniques simply diffused from group to group through cultural contact and trade, with existing European populations gradually adopting new methods without any large-scale movement of people actually being involved. Ancient genomes told a different story, revealing that early European hunter-gatherers and the incoming farming populations were, in many cases, genetically quite distinct from one another, and that the eventual population of farming-era Europe represented a substantial blending of these two very different ancestral groups, occurring over the course of many centuries as incoming farmers gradually spread across and intermarried with the populations already living across the continent. If the original blue-eyed mutation occurred in or near this same region, around the same general time period, it would have been perfectly positioned to spread outward along exactly the same migration routes that were already carrying farming technology, new tools, new burial customs, and enormous amounts of new genetic material into every corner of the European continent. A single individual carrying this new mutation, living within or alongside these expanding farming populations, would have had descendants who carried the trait forward, generation after generation, riding along on top of one of the largest and most thoroughly documented population expansions in prehistoric human history. Picture it this way. Every time a farming community expanded into new territory, establishing new settlements, clearing new land, and gradually absorbing or displacing the hunter-gatherer populations they encountered along the way, they were also, without anyone involved having the faintest idea, carrying an entire genetic payload forward with them. Every trait, every mutation, every tiny variation present in the DNA of the people making that journey. If the individual carrying the original blue-eyed mutation, or that person's immediate descendants, happened to be part of even one of these expanding farming communities, the trait would have been swept along automatically, spreading exactly as far and exactly as fast as the broader population expansion itself, without requiring any additional advantage of its own to explain at least the initial stages of how far it managed to travel. This raises a question that might not be obvious at first, but that turns out to matter enormously for understanding why blue eyes spread as widely and as successfully as they did. A single genetic mutation appearing in one person does not automatically spread to become common across an entire population purely through random chance. Genetic traits that provide no particular survival or reproductive advantage tend to remain rare, sometimes disappearing entirely within a few generations, due to nothing more than ordinary statistical chance. For blue eyes to spread from a single individual to eventually becoming the dominant eye color across large parts of northern and eastern Europe, something must have given carriers of this mutation a genuine advantage, whether through natural selection favoring the trait directly or through some kind of cultural or social preference that increased the reproductive success of individuals who carried it. Researchers have proposed several possible explanations for why this particular mutation may have spread so successfully, though this remains an area of ongoing scientific debate rather than a fully settled question. One leading hypothesis connects lighter eye color to the broader genetic shift toward lighter skin pigmentation that occurred as populations moved into higher latitude regions of Europe, where sunlight is less intense and less direct throughout much of the year. Lighter skin allows for more efficient vitamin D production in environments with reduced sunlight exposure, and some researchers believe that genetic changes affecting eye color may have been linked, at least partially, to the same broader adaptation toward lighter overall pigmentation, spreading together as populations pushed further north into regions with dramatically different light conditions than the Middle Eastern and Mediterranean environments their ancestors had originally come from. A separate and considerably more speculative hypothesis suggests that blue eyes may have spread at least in part through sexual selection, meaning the trait may have simply been considered attractive within certain ancient populations, giving individuals who carried it a reproductive advantage, independent of any direct survival benefit tied to the mutation itself. This idea remains difficult to test directly using genetic evidence alone, since sexual selection leaves a much subtler genetic signature than natural selection driven by clear survival pressures, and most researchers treat it as one plausible contributing factor among several rather than the single definitive explanation. There's also a third possibility worth mentioning, one that does not require any special advantage at all. Population geneticists have long known that in relatively small founding populations, especially ones undergoing rapid expansion into new territory, genetic traits can sometimes spread to high frequency through simple random chance alone, a phenomenon known as genetic drift. If the original mutation happened to occur within a small group of early farmers, who went on to have many descendants for reasons entirely unrelated to eye color, purely through the ordinary randomness of which families happen to expand fastest, the trait could have ridden along to surprisingly high frequency without needing any selective advantage whatsoever. Most researchers today suspect the real explanation likely involves some combination of all three factors working together: migration carrying the trait across vast distances, drift amplifying it within expanding founder populations, and some degree of selection, whether environmental or social, reinforcing it further once it had already become established within certain regions. A layered explanation that reflects how complicated real evolutionary history usually turns out to be once researchers stop looking for a single tidy cause and start accounting for everything actually at play. Regardless of exactly which combination of factors ultimately drove its spread, the genetic record makes clear that this mutation did spread remarkably successfully, moving outward from its original point of origin near the Black Sea, and eventually becoming common across huge portions of northern and eastern Europe, carried along by population movements, trade contact, and intermarriage across thousands of years of subsequent European history. From that original starting point, the trait eventually made its way, through migration, colonization, and the enormous population movements of the more recent past few centuries, to every populated continent on Earth, carried by descendants of European populations settling in the Americas, Australia, and beyond. There is something worth pausing on here because it reframes a trait most people never think twice about into something genuinely remarkable once you understand its actual history. Every single time you see someone with blue eyes anywhere in the world, you are looking at a living, walking piece of evidence connecting that individual back through an unbroken chain of ancestors, stretching across roughly 300 to 400 generations, all the way back to one specific person who lived near the Black Sea sometime between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. That person had no idea their eyes carried anything unusual. They almost certainly never knew their descendants would eventually number in the hundreds of millions, scattered across every inhabited continent on the planet. And yet, that single, tiny genetic accident, a change so small it altered nothing more than the amount of pigment in one part of the eye, ended up connecting an enormous fraction of humanity together through a shared line of descent more direct and more traceable than almost any other trait scientists have ever studied. Compare that to something like height or general body shape. Traits shaped by hundreds or even thousands of different genetic variants working together in complicated combinations, none of them individually traceable back to any single point of origin. Blue eyes stand almost entirely alone among common human traits in offering this kind of clean, singular ancestral story, which is part of why this particular piece of genetic research captured so much public attention when it was first published, and why it remains one of the most frequently cited examples of ancient DNA research whenever scientists want to explain, in terms an ordinary person can immediately grasp and even see reflected in a mirror, just how deeply interconnected the human species actually is beneath the surface of its outward diversity. A lesson that fits into a single glance in the mirror far more easily than most of the abstract statistics population geneticists usually have to work with. This also means something quietly profound about the relationship between blue-eyed individuals who, on the surface, might appear to have nothing whatsoever in common with each other. Two people with blue eyes, one born in rural Scandinavia and another born on the other side of the world, separated by every possible cultural, linguistic, and historical difference imaginable, are, in this one very specific and very real genetic sense, distant relatives, connected through an ancestor neither of them will ever be able to identify by name, but whose existence is written directly into their DNA regardless. It is a strange kind of kinship, invisible in every practical sense of daily life, yet completely real at the level of biology. There is one more layer to this story worth understanding, because it explains why blue eyes, despite tracing back to a single common ancestor, still show up with such varying intensity and shade across different individuals today, rather than appearing as one single, uniform blue. While the core OCA2-related mutation responsible for reduced melanin production is shared almost universally among blue-eyed individuals, the exact shade of blue any individual ends up with, whether pale, ice blue, deeper grayish blue, or blue with flecks of green or gray mixed in, is influenced by additional genetic variation layered on top of that original founding mutation. Variation that has accumulated differently across different populations and different family lines over the thousands of years since the original mutation first appeared. In other words, the underlying trait, the capacity for blue eyes at all, traces back to one single ancient source, but the specific visual expression of that trait has continued evolving and diversifying in the many thousands of years since, producing the wide range of blue-eyed variation we see scattered across different populations today. It is a useful reminder that a shared ancient origin does not mean an identical outcome. Descendants of that single original individual have spent thousands of years scattered across dramatically different environments, mixing with dramatically different populations, and accumulating dramatically different additional genetic variation layered on top of that one shared founding trait. The result is a family tree stretching across the entire globe, all connected back to the same starting point, yet expressing that shared inheritance in an enormous range of subtly different final forms, which is arguably a fitting metaphor for how human genetic diversity works more broadly, one shared ancient root producing an almost endless variety of visible outcomes, as it spreads outward across space and time. So when someone asks where blue eyes actually came from, the honest and thoroughly evidence-backed answer is genuinely remarkable. They came from one single person, living somewhere near the Black Sea region between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, carrying a genetic mutation that had never existed anywhere in the human species before that moment. That mutation spread outward through that individual's descendants, riding along the same great migratory currents that carried farming, new technology, and entirely new populations across the European continent during one of the most transformative periods in human prehistory, eventually reaching every corner of the globe through subsequent waves of migration and colonization, stretching all the way into the modern era. That is the story this DNA research actually tells, and it turns a trait most people have never given a second thought to into a genuinely extraordinary piece of living evidence for exactly how connected humanity actually is beneath the surface. It is easy to look around at the incredible diversity of human populations across the globe and assume that different groups, separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers of history, share very little in common at the genetic level. The story of blue eyes proves the opposite in one of the clearest and most visually obvious ways imaginable. A single ancient mutation carried forward across hundreds of generations, quietly linking an enormous fraction of humanity back to one single common ancestor whose name, face, and life story are lost entirely to history, but whose genetic legacy is written directly into the eyes of hundreds of millions of people who have never met each other and never will. If this video showed you anything, it is that even the most ordinary-looking physical traits can hide an extraordinary depth of ancient history, connections running back thousands of years that most people carry around their entire lives without ever knowing they're there. There are other traits out there, other seemingly ordinary features shared across huge portions of the human population, that trace back to similarly ancient and similarly singular origins, still waiting for genetic researchers to trace them back to their true beginning, hiding in plain sight the same way blue eyes did for every single person who ever looked into a mirror without knowing the full story behind what they were seeing. If you want to know which trait gets that same treatment next, make sure you are subscribed, because the next investigation in this series is already underway, and it might just reveal something hidden in your own reflection that you have never once stopped to think about.